Hello students, welcome to our continuing breakdown of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. This video will cover the study guide questions for part 2 of his essay, section 2. So let's start off with this key term. Ta-Nehisi Coates quotes a sociologist and historian, Robert J. Sampson, who states that the white and black communities of Chicago were ecologically distinct. Now, this concept that Sampson quotes of these two communities being ecologically distinct means more than just one was poor and one was rich. Instead, he wants to talk about how you have two completely different conditions. So, if we think generally, here is how the term ecologically distinct works, right? When we think in terms of nature, ecologically distinct represents two completely different ecological zones. For instance, the desert has nothing to do with the jungle. They are ecologically distinct. There's not any sort of relationship that the two share. So Sampson is applying this to the inequality of white and black communities in Chicago and the country, in that poor white communities and poor African American communities are so distinct that you can't really compare them. Even if they're both poor, the exploitation and differences of those communities in terms of the racial composition makes them unable to be compared. So it's more than just an analysis of poor and rich. Ecologically distinct means that when looking at the segregation of wealth and race in the United States, that we're really looking at two completely separate communities, and it's impossible or improbable in terms of Sampson's point of view to compare poor white communities with poor black communities, because the level of issues of health, education, safety are so completely distinct that they are almost like comparing the jungle to the desert. You can't compare two things because the differences amongst those communities are so vast. And Coates is using Sampson's quote here of ecologically distinct to show that the reason why we are in this place that we're at now can be traced all the way back through history to slavery. And then the lingering issues of Jim Crow and all of the things, for instance, Clyde Ross and his family went through. So if you remember Clyde Ross's story from the beginning of the essay, living in Jim Crow South, being cut out of officially buying a mortgage through proper channels, all of that is an example of an ecologically distinct life that Clyde Ross went through, as opposed to if he was white. And Coates underscores this ecologically distinct nature by saying, effectively, the black family in America is working without a safety net. Because they live in a completely ecologically distinct community, a community that has been denied legal access to various things like health, safety, crime, and education, that African Americans are in a much more precarious position in their own communities than white Americans, no matter how much money they make. So, because of this ecologically distinct breakdown of segregation to wealth, as mentioned by Sampson and Coates, why do African American families have a hard time moving into better neighborhoods? Coates explains this in a bunch of ways. First, he says that it's not just a matter of money. All right? Although wealth is important, Coates says that African Americans who make enough money to buy what he calls middle-class homes tend not to buy in middle-class neighborhoods. And it's not because they can't afford it. So Coates says there has to be something else here that leads us to this issue of African American families not being able to move to different and better, quote unquote, neighborhoods. So it's not just money. So he gives us some examples that prove that the reasons why was systemic racism. One, he gives the Federal Housing Administration and talks about how, in terms of providing loans and support to homeowners, the Federal Housing Administration developed a system of maps that rated neighborhoods according to their perceived stability. All right, so for those of you who don't know, the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, are one of the big groups that help people acquire mortgages, acquire loans, work with banks, and help homeowners purchase houses, especially for first-time homeowners. That's one of their key elements. And so the maps that Coates is talking about would outline all of Chicago. You can look on the essay and find Coates giving you an example of one of these FHA maps. It's in the essay. And if you look at that map, you will see it's colored differently. And green are for good, stable neighborhoods, of which the FHA would be willing to loan money to a homeowner, because if they're moving into this stable neighborhood, that usually represents that they have a stable job, they have a stable family life, and will be able to pay them back. So green areas on that map are rated A. They are neighborhoods that are in demand. They are good neighborhoods with good schools, good facilities, good services. All right. And on those maps, if you look at the ones on in the essay, historically, the FHA marked those for many years as neighborhoods that, as one appraiser notes, lacked a single foreigner or Negro, where the neighborhoods that African Americans were rated D and colored red. Hence the issue of redlining. If a neighborhood was not green or yellow, but was in the red, the FHA would oftentimes refuse to provide loans and support to people living in those neighborhoods, because there would be a danger that they couldn't pay back their loans. And as you can see, any neighborhoods that were heavily African American were almost automatically rated D. In fact, so much so, the essay talks about it, how the presence of a single African American family in a green neighborhood could change that rating from green to a lower yellow or different rating. So as Coates provides you, he says, one National Real Estate Association advised not to sell to a, quote, colored man of means who was giving his children a college education. So obviously, this example on page 9 shows that even if this man, this African-American man, who was obviously in a stable enough situation to provide his kids a college education, could not get an approved normal loan to buy a house simply because he was a man of color. So it's not just that African-American families might not have enough money. That is not the central issue. Coates is telling you that the central issue as to why African-American families have historically found it hard to move into different, more wealthily secured, better serviced neighborhoods is because, as he gives you the examples, simply racism. It is the continuance of Jim Crow laws by another name. Next, he says, well, what are some of the issues with this segregation of neighborhoods and communities? So Coates is asking, why is it bad that you can have neighborhoods segregated along race? So he gives you the example on page 10. With segregation, with the isolation of the injured and the robbed, comes a concentration of disadvantage. An unsegregated America might see poverty and all its effects spread across the country with no particular bias towards skin color. Instead, the concentration of poverty has been paired with a concentration of melanin. For those of you unaware, melanin is the aspect of skin that allows skin to retain pigment. So people of color have more melanin than Caucasians. This is just a scientific term. But what he is saying here is that with segregation, we have the elements of poverty, we see them more grouped around people of color's neighborhoods. If we were truly living in a colorblind country, quote says, we might see all of the things we know are issues of poverty spread across a variety of races. But since we have concentrations of poverty and we have those concentrations and those systematically placed on people of color, we see that the balance of poverty tends to align with the concentration of melanin. As in, we have set up a system in America that segregates poor along racial lines predominantly, and he goes into that with statistics throughout the essay. And that shows that the concentration of issues surrounding poverty tend to find those communities in which African Americans lived, because they have been isolated and segregated and denied the services that come with communities that we would see on that map that are green, that are stable. We will pick up this PowerPoint and this lecture in part 3.